With the Great Depression of the 1930s, a federal law was finally passed that banned child labor. All states required school attendance at least until age 16. Faced with hard times and crowded schools, educators increasingly used the IQ test to track students.
They believe you can start testing for IQ at about age 5, and that at age 10, the score stabilizes for life. They also believe that, although most IQ tests are longer, about 12 minutes will do it. The really favorite items of IQ testers are antonyms, synonyms, and analogies. And those are, very heavily dependent on what kind of house you grew up in.
This test would become a mark that they would have to carry for the rest of their lives. It must have been a heavy burden for children entering kindergarten or the first grade to be given a test, possibly in a language they didn't understand.
By the 1930s, 2/3 of the Mexican-American students in Los Angeles were classified as slow learners and even mentally retarded on the basis of IQ tests given as early as kindergarten.
We were held back, not because someone hated us, but because the teachers accepted who we were on the basis of our family and heritage and kind of assumed that we would repeat the pattern of our parents.
I expressed interest in some college prep classes, but they just said, well, they're kind of hard. We don't know if you want to concentrate or study that hard because you're doing so well in woodshop. And you should develop that skill.
During the Second World War, 20-year-old Henry Nava joined the Navy Medical Corps. He quickly noticed that servicemen with lower levels of education were assigned to the most hazardous duty.
I remember his saying that he saw many injured people in Hawaii, troops that were coming back with serious injuries, and he didn't want to have me go through that experience.
While home on leave, Henry Nava took his younger brother Julian to see the high school guidance counselor.
Henry insisted that I be allowed to take college prep courses and faced refusal. And he leaned over on the desk and he told the counselor, "You didn't hear me. Julian is going to take college prep courses."
Julian Nava graduated in 1945 and went on to earn a doctorate in history from Harvard University. He was later elected to the Los Angeles Board of Education, and in 1979 was named U.S. Ambassador to Mexico by President Jimmy Carter. Nava's success defied the educational odds facing minority students.
One of the things that is standard practice during this time is to assume that Mexican children were not going to be able to compete with Anglo-American children, and therefore they needed to be segregated. Some districts didn't even require intelligence tests. They just created the Mexican school as an industrial school, assuming that this is the kind of work that they were capable of doing.
Industrial training dominated the curriculum at Native American boarding schools run by the federal government.
In the boarding schools, the emphasis was upon taking away people's culture and replacing it with the dominant white Anglo-Saxon culture of the United States. An important part of that was getting rid of Native American languages.
In segregated schools throughout the South, African American girls were taught domestic science, and boys learned to work with their hands.
And when we look at the curricula that was developed, domestic science for women, industrial education for African Americans, boarding schools for Native Americans, much of what developed under the guise of a democratic and differentiated curriculum was in fact a way to reinforce the kind of class, gender, and race prejudice that existed in society.
Millions of students in the post-war era continued to be evaluated by the IQ test and its cousin, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, or SAT. Critics have condemned both tests for being culturally biased.
It's been an enormous loss to our country. We'll never know how many Dr. Salks or Pablo Casals or Picassos have been lost because children from minority groups were not inspired or challenged and given the chance to show what they've got.
In the 1960s and 70s, Julian Nava led a successful fight to ban IQ testing in the Los Angeles schools. Other minority leaders helped to end career tracking in the schools of Washington, D.C. Testing and tracking remain controversial to this day. After World War II, more students were staying in school longer than ever before.
School days, dear old golden rule days, reading and writing and I was your best.
Now, Bobby Soxers were making school the center of their social lives. Educators worried about reaching all the teenagers of so-called average intelligence.
What do we do with the 60% of students who are not gaining anything from a college preparatory curriculum or a vocational curriculum? The answer that was given by educators was, we will give them life adjustment education.
Created by the U.S. Office of Education, Life Adjustment sought to extend progressive education to teenagers and make school relevant to their daily lives. It offered practical lessons in family life, hygiene, and health. Life adjustment was not progressive education as John Dewey had envisioned it. Yet, prominent critics blasted the entire movement. Progressive education was regressive education, according to historian Arthur Bester.
He would sometimes look at my social studies textbooks and feel that they were inadequate because lots of things were being spoon-fed to students. They weren't forced to think through from this set of information, analyze it in some framework, evaluate the data you have, and come to conclusions.
Many schools really gave up the intellectual mission, and they became much more concerned with social adjustment, life adjustment.
Critics of American education argue that it's been downhill ever since the progressives started adding on course after course to what had been a more traditional curriculum. But if you've ever spent the entire day sitting as students do in a math class and an English class and a history class, and then go to the shop class, or go to the art class, or go to the music class, you realize how this kind of variety enhances school and enhances the kinds of skills and knowledge and relationships that students need to take away from school.
Post-World War II critics like Arthur Bester saw American schools as flabby, unintellectual, and these notions strengthened the return of traditional schools that John Dewey himself had railed against at the beginning of the 20th century. And so you have this cyclical kind of movement between progressive and traditional kinds of teaching, learning, and schooling that has gone on in American schools for almost a century.
My father was writing during the height of the McCarthy era, and I think that he was very much committed to the idea that the American political system requires an educated, articulate, intelligent citizenry, and that if the schools don't provide people with the tools for doing that, what will become of us?